On to the next talk. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elke Bippus here, who teaches art theory and art history at the Zurich University of the Arts, where she's senior researcher in the Department of Cultural Criticism and Cultural Analysis, and with artist Mark Bauer teaches art in the BA program as well. Her research interests include modern and contemporary art, image and representation theory, performativity, artistic production techniques and processes, politics and aesthetics, and art as an epistemic, feminist, and anti-hierarchic practice. Bippus lecture, Hanne Darboven, I Don't Describe, I Write, Scenes of Autofictional Writing and the Order of Things, approaches Darboven as a writer and collector from the perspective of the performative and autofictional, and examines her doing in terms of its significance for current art production with a focus on the potential of the system. Developed by the artist in the 1960s, which creates an order of things in which the biographical and personal are intertwined with cultural history and politics. Here, the materialized form of Hanne Darboven's system develops an affective power that writes bodies and worlds rather than describing them. Welcome, Elke.
Yeah, thank you, Milan, for the kind introduction. Also, I would like to thank you for the invitation. Although it was a challenge due to the short notice, and Hanne Darboven is not part of my current research focus, but I realized while I prepared the lecture how important her work was for me, or is still for me. It's really formed the basis for my approach to art and my thinking about art. So I'm very grateful to be part of this activity of writing itself. It is writing on paper which from 1971 onwards includes transcriptions of previously published philosophical, historical, lexical or literary text, but also daily computations, Tagesrechnungen, the word numbers, Zahlen, Worte, wörtlich, the U-waves, U-bögen, or the numerical sequences from the system Darboven developed during her stay in New York from 1966 to 1968. In the 1970s, some critics were obviously overwhelmed by this form of writing in conjunction with a system and accordingly attributed gendered clichés to the artist's work with the intention of discrediting it. The writing was considered diligent and repetitive, an activity for a woman who knits herself through history, thus reducing world history to a household account book. In my contribution, I will examine Hanne Darboven's writing from the perspective of post-structuralist theories of performativity and reasoned discourses on autofiction, autotheory, and new materialism, as these enables the critical reading of her work methods and allow us to reflect on the understanding of subject and history that has been challenged by the artist's work, but also to highlight aspects of the work that are the subject of more recent artistic productions. The presentation unfolds in 5 parts. In the first, I will contextualize Darboven's early work within the US art scene of the 1960s. In the second, I analyze her system as a form of weaving, both literal and conceptual. The third section focuses on autofiction as subjectivization. A brief excursus will follow, exploring the process of weaving in relation to coding, which I will then thread into a discussion of contemporary artwork. Finally, I will read some of Darboven's often cryptic sentences from her correspondence to provide insight into her system and working method. Working with sketches, writing, and communication systems. In the 1960s, words, numbers, and diagrammatic structures became standard materials in visual art, shaping the visual language of the young, conceptually oriented New York art scene. Drafts and preparatory work processes themselves became worthy of exhibition. The exhibition Working Drawings and Other Visible Things on paper not necessarily meant to be viewed as art, curated by Mel Bochner in 1966, made this development clearly visible by exhibiting 4 file folders, each containing 100 photocopies, showed the working drafts of artists such as Donald Judd, Karl André, Soluit, Eva Hesse, and many others. In 1969, Hanne Darboven took part in the exhibition Conception, which had a similar focus and was curated by Rolf Wedewer and Konrad Fischer. In this foreword, Wedewer explains that the drafts on display give rise to an art that, quote, can no longer be judged by its respective form of appearance, but similar to other communication media by its methodological possibilities. In this sense, he writes, for the draft as final form, the renunciation of a self-contained structure assigns a new role not only to the artist but also to the viewer. In conceptual art, the creative act does not result in a finished structure but remains consistently in an open processual form. In addition to this exhibition, that was the contribution by her, Hanne Darboven had already participated in major exhibitions during her years in New York that brought art into play in this processual form and as a medium of communication and information, and precisely not as a representation of reality or inner sensitivities. Noteworthy are the numbers exhibitions curated by Lucy Lippert, such as Number 7 at the Paula Cooper Gallery in New York in May 1969, and 500,057.87, which was shown in Seattle in 1969 and subsequently in Vancouver under the title 955,000. These exhibitions made this trend in art visible and open to discussion. Furthermore, the artist's works were shown in the exhibitions Language 2, 1968, and Language 3, 1969, part of the 4 language shows realized by the Dwan Gallery, and in 1970, Darboven participated in the exhibition Information, curated by Kynaston McShine at the Museum of Modern Art. With the exhibition and the works of 150 artists, McShine addressed the issue of informing society through mass media, television, cinema, newspaper, magazines, and communication technologies, satellites, telegrams, telex. He used it to reinforce his thesis that the artist is confronted with the question, quote, to what he can do with contemporary media that reach many more people than the art gallery. From this point of view, the changed representation and what art can achieve in an information society is the new challenge for contemporary art. Artists are called upon, quote, to think of concepts that are broader and more cerebral than the expected product of a studio. McShine goes on to note that given the mobility and constant change of our times, there is a growing interest in the exchange of ideas rather than the production of objects. The viewing of words, diagrams, and words in lists and in folders thus dominated numerous exhibitions in the late 1960s and changed the behavior of visitors. It is noteworthy that, unlike some of her artist friends such as Karl André, Lawrence Wiener, and Mel Bochner, Hanne Darboven did not limit herself to the visual, aesthetic, spatial, and poetic dimension of numbers and words. She began to copy already published texts, as in the 1979 work Sand. Using her system, she intertwined world history, biographical, and political elements, thus moving toward communication and autobiography. With this approach of intertwining the self, system, and cultural history, Darboven pursued an artistic practice that fundamentally questioned the understanding of art and subject. It was not until the 1990s, in the wake of post-structuralist debates that arrived in Germany or in German-speaking countries, via the US detour of cultural studies that the critical dimensions of Darboven's system became legible, for example, in historiography. The system weaving and constellating. As Bridget Doherty has outlined, Hanne Darboven sought, quote, in the wake of minimalism to find a form other than painting or sculpture in which her art might speak a public language. Writing and what conceptual art referred to as theoretical art became fundamental to her in this search. In the context of debates about art as a medium of communication and information, she developed a practice that intertwines production and representation, intertwines the sequential nature of writing with the spatial structure of the image media and the exhibited objects, and thus provokes new ways of seeing and reading images, material culture, and writing. Like conceptual artists who did not focus on the sensory appearance of works, Darboven was concerned with exploring the potentialities of her system. As Wedewer emphasized, conceptual art, sketches are not, as in land art, for example, preparatory studies for yet-to-be-formed objects. Rather, they are models of communication, documentation, and information. By combining calendar drawings and transcription of texts, Darboven engages with cultural, historical, and political themes, and thus with the social function of art, without endangering what she considers to be the necessary independence of art, which she clearly distinguishes from a representational function. Her goal is enlightenment, writes Ernst Busche, noting that the artist leaves us, I quote, so relentlessly sitting in her upper-class village school, because she believes in enlightenment, reason, and knowledge. This description associates the artist's encyclopedic writing with punishment, which seems to have been common in the reception of her work in the 1980s. Her knowledge, conviction of, and trust in enlightenment and reason were read by some as dry, austere, and even joyless. However, the artist's works contradict a naive trust that is exhausted in the belief in the autonomous subject of knowledge or history. The search for happiness, for the ideal society, the idea of freedom, or the equating of enlightenment with the theory of progress. What seems significant to me, therefore, is not only the knowledge that Darboven's work conveys, which corresponds to the canon of the upper-class European or German background of her time, but more importantly, how Darboven's school of seeing conveys knowledge, and that she is obviously concerned with knowledge in the plural. The writing that the artist practiced with discipline in the rhythm of an 8-hour day can be seen as an attitude of modernity. This attitude originated in the Enlightenment, as Michel Foucault showed in his examination of Immanuel Kant. Darboven writings repeat the modern claim of enlightenment under the condition of a crisis of the possibility of universal representation. To be modern, as Foucault puts it, is not to accept oneself as one is in the flow of passing moments. It is to make oneself the object of a complex and rigorous elaboration. Appropriately, Darboven does not offer a singular worldview, she informs worldviews. Writing as an autofictional intra-action. Art historian Gregor Stemrich has shown that the American art debate since the 1930s has been dominated by a fear of mass culture. Art critics such as Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, as well as art historian Maya Shapiro, stylize the artist as, I quote Stemrich, the last guarantor of independent individuality. Artworks were invoked as the last handmade personal objects within our culture. The artists were supposed to counteract the regulating, typifying, and standardizing effects of serial mass production. The belief in the free, autonomous, and individually intentional subject articulated here was increasingly questioned in the 1960s. The crisis of the Cartesian subject was formulated by post-structuralist thinkers such as Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, or Helen Sissou. In his text, The Death of the Author, Roland Barthes liberates literature from the tyrannical restriction of the author, his person, his history, his taste, his passions. Creative power is traced in the communication media themselves, i.e., in the structural, material, and formal aspects of writing. It is often overlooked that Barthes' text first appeared in English in the sophisticated Aspen magazine number 5 and 6 in 1967, a year before the publication of the French original. The art magazine presented various media in a box. It included Sir Lewitt's serial project number 1 ABCD, scores by John Cage, contributions by Morten Feldman and Susan Sontag, an excerpt from Alain Robbe-Gries's novel Jalousie, various recordings such as Naum Gaubo reading the Realistic Manifesto, which he published with his brother Antoine Pevsner in 1920, and Marcel Duchamp reading his text, The Creative Act. According to Barthes, the birth of the reader must be paid for with the death of the author. Beyond this subject-centered view, it is worth recalling Barthes' theory to highlight its significance for the function and understanding of procedures, practices, and materials. The semiotician and literary theorist rejected biographism as a method in which the explanation of a text is centered on the author who created it. In an examination of text by Stéphane Mallarmé, Marcel Proust, and Paul Valéry, among others, he reflected on poetic language as a meaning-creating material and as a sign of the death of the author. The writer only emerges in the text, not as a transcendent guarantor of meaning, but as a linguistic figure composed of quotations and discursive cultural practices. In contrast to the author, who is understood as the past of the own book, the concept of the modern writer does not reduce text or image to the mere communication of a prior intention or to the mere materialization of prior ideas. On the contrary, the writer embodies him or herself and the history in a process that today, according to the theories of new materialism, can be described as interactive. Physicist and feminist theorist Karen Barat emphatically includes the power of the material in her considerations. She develops an active understanding of materiality and processes of materialization. In her theory of embodiment, form and content, discourse and matter not only interact, they interact. Boundaries, bodies, differences emerge in complex interrelationships from, I quote, particular entangled processes of materialization. Donna Haraway had argued similarly. According to her, materialization and meaning cannot be separated from one another. Rather, earthly existence is realized within multi-relational structures of semiotic material knots. In their performative relational approach, these posthuman conceptions are comparable to the model of informing as described by Dan Graham in his editorial to Aspen Magazine number 8 in 1971 and proposed by Jacques Derrida in a lecture in the 1960s. To quote Derrida, "Information does not inform merely by delivering an informational content, it gives form. And here he used the German words informiert, formiert zugleich, that means it informs and simultaneously forms. Darboven's embodied performative writing becomes evident in her quotational practice, which does not aim to represent the artist's individuality and yet produces singularity in relational processes. Her sheets do not satisfy the desire to trace the artist's self. The autopoetic words articulate an autobiography in relation to Darboven's bourgeois commercial background, to cultural history, especially German, European, and a conception shaped by the US art scene. Her carefully staged photographic self-portraits reflect this self-positioning. In the 1960s and 70s, we see the minimalist persona, but since the 1980s, the artist has shown herself surrounded by objects from her collection at her workplaces. Visually and textually, Darboven plays with the viewer's desire to see behind the mask. This tension is also evident in Kleine Selbstbiografie, small autobiography, and the text that can be read here is, I quote, "As I write this, I'm 27 years old, but I could also write 3 years or 50,000. These lines are not self-expressions in the strict sense. They are a transcription marked with quotation marks of a text by the writer Klabund. Darboven rejects a representation that aims at similarity in favor of situating herself in a US-American artistic and European bourgeois context. In a letter to her family from December 10th, 1967, Darboven writes, "No one knows me, nor my doing, acting passively with. With may sound contradictory, yet a kind of activity develops, which I don't know. Must I say it again, this somewhat hidden, ambivalent matter, my pleasure? With Judith Butler, the doing that develops an activity can be described with the subject constituting process of performativity and materialization, which are linked to repetitions. For Butler, citation is an act that gives the subject its existence. To cite means that a subject must repeat certain self-references to develop a certain identity and thus a form. The format of autofiction, autotheory, or the personal essay has been experiencing a renaissance in recent years with significant conceptual shifts. In the recent past, autotheory, autofiction became popular with Paul B. Preciado's Testo Junkie in 2013 and his film Orlando 2023, or Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts in 2015, for example. In the field of contemporary art, autotheoretical works became virulent with the rediscovery of texts by Chris Kraus and Kathy Ecker, among others. Autofictional or autotheoretical narrative forms should by no means be dismissed as a mere trend or a romanticized revival of a sovereign authorial subject. The I that writes itself in this autofictional format has never believed in the independent self. Autofiction is not about the creative power of a genius, but rather about representing different subjectivities that exist but are often excluded, marginalized, and not allowed along the lines of majority normative thinking. In the second part of my paper, I would like to discuss Darboven's constellating aesthetic practices from two perspectives. First, through her rigorous formalized method, which is similar to a programming language, and second, through the lens of an order of things, as characterized by Michel Foucault. In this framework, Darboven's practice constitutes not just an aesthetic system, but also a philosophical one, an ordering of knowledge, identity, and historical time. Weaving threads, coding. In 1972, art critic John Anthony Thwaites wrote about the artist's exhibition at the Westfälische Kunstverein Münster. I quote, "Hanne Darboven's art shows mutations Hanne Darboven's art shows mutations I'm not competent to analyze. In a world of computer and electronic art objects, she might well have a place. Otherwise, it is the danger she must face. Her work could easily degenerate into a kind of higher knitting with a female quality of patience, detail, and not much else. A pioneer or a Penelope of the 20th century." This supposed attempt to enhance the value of Darboven's number system by referring to to new computer technologies while at the same time discrediting the process as higher knitting overlooks the fact that Darboven's state system and Penelope's strategy do not follow the technique of knitting, but rather the art of weaving, which creates a hypertext, a network. Darboven did not design a linear structure, but rather wove together different threads. In 1996, Darboven revisited Thwaites' quote in Webstuhlarbeit, writing next to a picture of the loom she had set as a child, Am Burgberg, meiner Mutter, posthum, a higher knitting Penelope. As early as 1990, she had stated in an interview, "My work surely isn't incomprehensible manipulating the data in the sense of computer age." The artist's work seems, as Bridget Doherty noted, indeed mostly remote from our epoch of electronic data processing and computer-aided design. Nevertheless, her work has been repeatedly linked to the emerging cultural techniques of her time. According to Johannes Kladders, the swelling and subsiding of boxes, numbers, or word numbers literally reappears in Darboven's films after 6 books, as well as in computer graphics. However, Kladders makes a distinction in his introductory text to Darboven's solo exhibition mit 6 Filmprojektoren nach 6 Büchern in 1969. He writes, I quote, "Darboven's work lie before the computer. They belong more to the programming office." A comparison of Darboven's work with computer technology at the level of programming is remarkable because it is less about data processing and computer-aided design than about the possibilities of the algorithm of Darboven's system. In this regard, it would be worthwhile to compare Darboven's practice with artistic works that reflect the constitutive role of women in the development of computer technologies. In the 1960s, women were often employed in the field of computer science. This was justified by their diligence, patience, and natural organizational talent, which was said to be like planning a dinner party. We could say, feminism loves another science, Berlin and Düsseldorf-based artist Katrin Meyer launched the website of her platform Coda in 2022, a research project that deals with feminist methods of coding and writing. The platform Coda sees itself as a historiography of programming, as l'écriture féminine, that means, according to Sissou, a writing through the body, and as an archive at the same time. The textual and visual contributions commissioned by the artist from France and her network reflect the potential inherent in the idea of the web and the politics of feminist writing. In Meyer's words, Coda embraces, I quote, "polyphonic voices, intertextual appropriations, an interest in automatic writing, shared research instead of genius, translation processes, having an affinity for subjects that are not one, sociality, weaving and networking skills, glitches, a topological notion of thinking and space, etc." Many of these characteristics resonate with Darboven's practice, not only in her interweaving of text, but also in her emphasis on materiality, repetition, and process over authorial expression. The platform connects lectures, articles, websites, and publications in the form of a link base to coding and writing, so that it writes rather than describes women's participation in the creation of the web. In this way, it locates its aesthetic and ethical claim historically in feminist writing styles and programming, which are simultaneously remembered through writing. Hanne Darboven's interweaving process, her experiments with numbers and writings make it clear, as Petra Lange-Berndt and Dietmar Rübe write, that she increasingly develops a kind of anti-hermeneutics. It is not the already known and normative knowledge that is confirmed. The constellating system of interweaving enables, to quote Lange Bernd-Rübel, an open dialogue between people and, on a more abstract level, between conventions and traditions of literature or historiography. Writing oriented toward normative categories, which submits to the social hierarchies of people, animals, and things, or the strict demarcation between social systems, such as the art world, family, and history, is rendered ineffective by Darboven's system. Darboven's artist house, overflowing with collected objects, is not a spatial biography in the usual sense. To interpret it as an eccentric reflection of a private self is to miss the point. The artist's house also informs a structure of space, time, and things. Lange Bernd and Rübel recognize it as an experimental system. This is described by Hans-Jörg Reinberger as place of emergence, as structures we have devised to capture the inconceivable. Darboven's Experimentalsystem produces histories instead of illustrating existing knowledge. The Order of Things. In 1966, Michel Foucault's The Order of Things was published in France under the title Les mots et les choses. While we cannot assume that Hanne Darboven was familiar with this publication, referencing it is nevertheless illuminating. The English title, The Order of Things, and the German title, Die Ordnung der Dinge, correspond to the title Foucault had originally intended. However, the French title corresponds to what Foucault's book is about. In it, Foucault combines questions of the history of knowledge with questions of language analysis and aesthetics. Specifically, he examines the different ways in which words and things were connected in the Western history of knowledge from the 16th to the 20th century. He is concerned with the ways in which the sayable and the visible are connected. This was also a concern of Darboven. In a letter dated April 3rd, 1968, she writes to her parents about tidying up and clearing out her studio apartment in New York. I quote, "I find myself between things, material and immaterial, visible and invisible, tangible and intangible." Even if this statement refers specifically to the objects in Darboven's apartment, it also refers to her Zettelwirtschaft paper chaos, concrete to the lines, numbers, words, and her doing. In her early work, created in New York, Darboven executes connections between the sayable and the visible. She characterized the connections as a system that makes the function of the lines, numbers, and words legible, traceable, and predictable as designations, as she states in the same letter in which she notes, "One had to accept some kind of order, i.e. within my actions, my system, because everything is nothing, not everything." My lecture focuses on Darboven's system, the connection it makes possible, and the role of doing and writing in her work. I wanted to draw your attention to these structural elements and invite you to engage with the interwoven world that Darboven's aesthetic form opens up. Darboven's system is linked to processes and techniques of interruption, to leaps that allow us to leave the familiar behind in our thinking, to detach ourselves from constant progress, take detours, or even stray onto paths that are unfamiliar to us. In this sense, the artist wrote to her parents, "Make lots of sketches, move logically from one construction to the next, but in between, I also take leaps, that is, I abandon rigor for a while and experiment." The word heute, today, which can be read as a vanitas symbol and recurs in numerous works by Darboven, also refers to the viewer's present as a temporal index and marks the time of writing as lost. In this sense, Darboven's visualization practice raises the intangible demand for a representation of reality and the liveliness of a process, only to dismantle it at the same time. Her writing conveys itself as a de-representation. Darboven does not designate time, but records it in a performative manner. Various historical periods are evoked through the text quotations and, in accordance with the individually framed paginated sheets, placed in a linear sequence. The tableau-like hanging of the frames, which allows for different reading directions and even provokes relationships across frames through graphic similarities, evokes a spatial juxtaposition. Darboven's writing thus creates a space that does not prescribe a direction of reading, but rather presents itself as malleable and heterogeneous space open to diverse modes of reception and rejection, the authoritarian character of a predetermined interpretation. Methodologically, the repetitive constellative textual procedure inherently invites meaning to arise outside of what is already known. What's more, the staging of writing in Darboven's work ensures that language does not disappear into meaning. On the contrary, it reveals itself in its materiality and effective power and can become a medium of thought. If one opens oneself to this unfamiliarity, a modified grasp becomes possible, a meaning outside the familiar. In this sense, the exhibition becomes an experimental system, much like Darboven's studio. The spatial presentation, marked by simultaneity and juxtaposition, transforms seeing into a kind of art, or more precisely, a performative reading practice. The viewer is drawn into a process of seeing and reading at once, grounded in a specific spatio-temporal experience. Following Dan Graham, we might say the reading informs what is represented. The practice of writing reading in Darboven's work mirrors that of seeing reading. In other words, these practices are equally active on the production side and the reception side. I'm delighted that the Kunstverein Hamburg is going to transform.
Otis? Yeah, thank you very much. We have now the opportunity to open the floor for questions. Milan, you're already looking at me as if...
No, I was looking at the talk.
Okay, sorry.
Life world of this work and maybe the way that a reception of the work is changing. I think Kirsty and I, for example, come to this place and one of our main points of entry to the practice is the house. It might have been the same for you, but your reading is not so strongly biographical. It's about the staging, it's about a kind of the artifice of identity also. How do you think of that paradigm and perhaps the ways it's changed? Sometimes we move to more authentic readings of who people are. Sometimes we move away from them. And where would you place your own experience of Hanne in relationship to your reading of the work?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, of course, I think more really go into the structure. And but like I tried to show here, it's not that you can separate it in this way to see to say, okay, there is this systematical work of her, and then there is this biography, and to make it in a way cute, and we can really go behind the mask. For me, it's really how she works, and that I understand it very much from this performative way, and that means at the same time I never will get her, but I always create her. And yeah, and I think because of that, there is a change in the reception, right? It's more the interest now on her things and her autobiography, but I think it's there from the beginning, but we didn't see it because then we said, okay, even we could say, okay, it's a strange person, and but then we try to go to the structure, and I think there's really it's intertwined.
Any further questions? Yes. I'm coming.
I will try to formulate, and I think this is it's a very good page, Bismarck-Zeit, if work and novels, I remain bourgeois. And my question is, it touches exactly that point in relation to her method of editions. And I would like you, I think it's your expertise, and I would like your comment, a comment about the fact that although it's part of the art market to make editions, whatever, they are usually very reduced.
Mm-hmm.
And Wouter Koenig mentions somewhere in an interview about her that she always pushed it to make, for example, this work is pretty big, but Kulturgeschichte, Welttheater, anyway, you name it, there's so many works that have been made in quite large editions, which is, I think it's very much of the time, I would say, but also it touches very interesting questions about value structure in the art world. So if you could comment on that.
About
I'm
the
very curious
editions,
about
why she did it.
Well, and also how do you see it? Because I think it's very different from other practices, and because it's very much based on the book, and that the work should be maybe accessible to a larger number of people, or as Paula pointed before, Schreibzeit is addressed to everyone. So this is a very intense, I think, part of her work, and it touches directly the information point.
I meant,
So that's why I'm curious about your take on it.
That was also a discussion in the 60s to make artwork more accessible, and because of that the interest in edition were very obvious there. And she said once to me that she wasn't interested in the catalogs which are showing installation views, and she was always interested to give access to the works, and she chose some of her papers and reproduced that in the editions. And it's really like that if you have the catalog, okay, it's not the whole, but the more expensive editions it's the whole, but the smaller editions it's not the whole. But anyway you get an access and you can go and read it, and then you can really get the structure of her work because of that. And I think that was very much important for her to make it accessible in this way. Is that more?
Okay, if there are... Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
Sorry. Thank you. I'll try to synthesize my thoughts into a question. You made this reference to autofiction and to the Argonauts and to Chris Kraus and this trend, and I wonder if you could put some more words to that, because for me those practices are so much about the body and so intimate and kind of coming out of this idea of confessional literature and the minor or something, whereas and this quote about that autofiction is not about the creative power of the genius, but kind of this like highly subjective place. But to me, Hanne Darboven's work actually does seem to be somehow about genius, or it has this incredible sort of grandeur that to capture a whole century, or there's something to me that's just very different from this kind of feminist approach, which we also heard in the previous lecture, that it's more of a kind of public language, or it disguises itself as a public language, which then can't actually really be deciphered.
But don't you think for me the feminist language in her work is really this part of interweaving something? And if you go to Chris Kraus' text, I Love Dick, it's also about how you fictionalize something and create something, and I think she's also doing and fictionalizing all her stuff. And here I see the connections between the autofictional, and it's not that we can go behind the mask and see her. And I think it's really more this interweaving structure she's using to create her works, and with her work and with her writing, her persona.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no more questions, we'll do a 10-minute break now and then continue with Sam's presentation. And I would just like to remind you, if you still haven't had a tour through the house, please contact me. Elke Bippus was kind enough to offer tours later on as well. We'll try to make it possible for everyone. Unfortunately, some of you have seen the house already. The space is very limited, so we'll try to make it possible, but please be patient. Thank you very much. See you in a minute.